A young billionaire feeds a homeless girl without knowing she's his missing daughter. What happens next is unbelievable. The clock read 3 in the morning when James Lancaster finally closed his laptop. Through the office window, the city lights flickered like artificial stars. He poured himself another drink, his 5th of the night. The whiskey no longer tasted like anything. James had everything money could buy. His closet was filled with handmade Italian suits. He slept on Egyptian cotton sheets in the most expensive penthouse in the city. His company was worth billions, and his name appeared in business magazines. Powerful people took his calls on the first ring, but none of that mattered. Mr. Lancaster, don't forget about the 9 o'clock meeting, his assistant reminded him over the intercom before leaving. James didn't even reply. He walked to the glass wall that revealed the city at his feet. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept through an entire night. Sleep was a luxury he no longer allowed himself. His reflection in the glass showed a 40-year-old man who looked closer to 50. Deep dark circles under his eyes, grey hair at the temples. The price of success, some would say, but he knew the truth. On the coffee table, face down, there was a photo he couldn't bear to look at for long. A newborn baby, wrapped in a pink blanket. Lily, his daughter. 6 years had passed since she was taken from him. 6 years since someone broke into his home and took her away forever. The investigations led nowhere. The private detectives failed. For the first time in James's life, money couldn't solve his problem. It was easier to work until he collapsed. Easier to close deals, buy companies, destroy competitors. Anything not to think, not to feel. He kept telling himself that the pain would pass with time. That was a lie. The pain never went away. It just changed shape. It became a void no multi-million-dollar contract, professional achievement, or fleeting company could fill. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Another problem to solve. Another welcome distraction. "Lancaster," he answered curtly. "Sir, we have a situation with the project in Asia. I'll be there in 20 minutes. James grabbed his jacket, glanced once more at the overturned photo, and left. It was just another night spent running from the silence that haunted him. Loneliness had become his only constant companion. 3 weeks after that sleepless night, fall arrived in full force in the city. James adjusted his coat as he stepped out of the Le Marseille restaurant, where he had just closed a deal with French investors. The cold wind stung his face, carrying dry leaves that danced in the air before landing on the sidewalk. "Mr. Lancaster, would you like me to call you a cab?" the maitre d' asked, and ever attentive. "No, thank you. My car is parked just over there." James nodded and walked along the sidewalk. He was tired, more than usual. Dinner had dragged on for hours, full of expensive wine and empty talk about profits and expansion. Just another success to add to his collection of meaningless victories. His car was waiting less than 100 yards away, a sleek, understated German machine, just the way he liked it. James wasn't the type to flaunt his wealth. It was evident in the details. In his watch, in the cut of his suit, in the way people treated him when they recognized his name. Then something caught his attention. A movement in the dark alley between the restaurant and the adjacent building. A small figure stirred near a large dumpster. James would normally have ignored it and gone on his way. City problems weren't his problems, but something made him pause. He took a few steps toward the alley, squinting to see in the dim light. What he saw made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. A child, a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6. She was curled up against the wall, hugging her knees tightly, as if trying to occupy as little space as possible. She wore a coat too thin for that cold night, stained and torn at the sleeves. Her light brown hair, tangled, fell over her pale face. James froze. The girl was trembling. 6 years old, the same age Lily would have been. "Hey!" he called, his voice sounding strange, almost choking. The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were large and dark, wide with fear. She didn't reply, only curled up more tightly. "Are you all right?" James asked, knowing how foolish the question was. Of course she wasn't all right. No answer. Just those huge, wary eyes fixed on him. Without thinking too much, James turned around and went back to the restaurant. The maitre d' greeted him in surprise. "Did you forget something, Mr. Lancaster? I need some takeout, quickly." "Certainly, sir. Any preference?" "Something hot, soup maybe, and sandwiches. Dessert too." He hesitated. "And a bottle of water." 10 minutes later, James walked out carrying a bag full of food. He headed straight back to the alley, afraid the girl might have disappeared, but she was still there, watching his every move with mistrust. James approached slowly and crouched a few feet away, trying not to seem threatening. He placed the bag on the ground and gently pushed it in her direction. "I brought you something to eat," he said in a low voice. The girl looked at the bag, then at James, then back at the bag again. Her stomach growled loudly enough for him to hear. "It's okay," he continued. "You can take it." After a few seconds that felt like forever, she stretched out and pulled the bag closer, never taking her eyes off him. With quick movements, she opened it and found a steaming container of soup. Her eyes lit up. "Be careful. It's hot," James warned. She grabbed the spoon clumsily and started eating with a desperation that broke his heart. James stayed there, crouched, silently watching. He didn't know why he was doing this. On any other day, he would have walked on, maybe made a donation to a charity later to soothe his conscience. As the girl ate, James noticed the details. Her small, dirty fingers, a makeshift bandage on her wrist, her worn-out sneakers, a small beaded bracelet, worn but carefully tied around her left arm. "What's your name?" he asked when she was halfway through the sandwich. The girl chewed slowly, as if weighing whether it was worth answering. "Emily," she finally said, so softly that James almost didn't hear it. "Emily," he repeated. "I'm James." She nodded slightly and went back to eating. "Where are your parents, Emily?" The question made the girl stop chewing. Her eyes filled with something James recognized instantly, the same emptiness he saw in the mirror every morning. "I don't know," she replied. "Are you here on your own?" Emily shook her head. "Margaret and Robert are working. They'll be back later." She pointed to the back of the alley. "We live back there." James looked in the direction she indicated and noticed, for the first time, a small makeshift area behind stacked boxes. There were blankets, a few plastic bags with belongings, a broken flashlight. "Are they your parents?" "No," Emily said, taking the water bottle, "but they take care of me." James felt a pang in his chest. The night was getting colder. Instinctively, he removed his own scarf, pure cashmere, probably worth more than everything this child possessed, and offered it to her. "It's cold. Take this." Emily hesitated, looking at the scarf like it was something alien. "It's really pretty," she said, not touching it. "And now it's yours," James insisted. Carefully, she reached out and took the scarf, running her fingers over the soft fabric as if it was something precious. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping it around her neck. The scarf went around twice, and there was still some left over. An awkward silence settled between them. James didn't know what to do next. Logic told him to call social services, the police, someone who could help the child, but something stopped him. Those eyes. There was something familiar he couldn't explain. "Emily, how old are you?" "6, she replied, confirming what James had guessed. 6 years old. Exactly how old Lily would be. "Do you live here?" "In this alley?" Emily shrugged, as if it were no big deal. "Sometimes, other days we go to the park if it's not too cold." James felt his stomach drop. In the same city where he owned an apartment with more rooms than he used, this child slept in alleys and parks. "Emily, is there some way I can help you? Maybe take you and your friends somewhere warmer tonight." Her face hardened with immediate distrust. "No, thank you," she said, edging away. "Margaret said never to go with strangers." James raised his hands in surrender. "Margaret's right. It was just an idea." At that moment, they heard footsteps approaching the alley. Emily stood up quickly, fear apparent on her face. James also rose, instinctively placing himself between the girl and whoever was coming. A middle-aged woman appeared, carrying plastic bags. Upon seeing James, her weathered face contorted in alarm. Seeing Emily behind him, she dropped the bags and ran toward them. "Emily, stay away from him," the woman shouted. "Margaret, no, he's nice," Emily replied. "He brought food." Look. The woman, Margaret apparently, stopped a few feet away, studying James with suspicious eyes. Her greying hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her face bore signs of a hard life. She wore multiple layers of clothing, all worn but clean. "Who are you?" she asked bluntly. "James Lancaster. He gestured vaguely at the bag of food. "I saw Emily here alone and thought she might be hungry." Margaret continued to size him up, as if deciding whether he was a threat. "Lancaster? From Lancaster Enterprises?" James nodded, surprised she knew him. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "What's a man like you doing, giving food to a homeless kid?" The question caught him off guard. What was he doing after all? Why had he stopped? Why did he care? "I just wanted to help," he answered honestly. Emily ran to Margaret, showing her the scarf. "Look what he gave me, Margaret. It's so soft." Margaret's expression softened slightly at the girl's excitement. She touched the scarf and looked back at James with a new look. Not so much distrust, but curiosity. "Well, thank you for the food, Mr. Lancaster, but I think it's time for Emily to call it a night." James nodded, feeling strangely reluctant to leave. He looked at Emily once more, at those big eyes that seemed to hold a mystery he couldn't decipher. "Can I come back sometime? Maybe bring more food?" Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Emily, on the other hand, broke into a small smile, the first he had seen, revealing a gap where a baby tooth had fallen out. "Can you make mac and cheese?" the girl asked James, the man who dined in Michelin-starred restaurants worldwide and had personal chefs at his disposal, smiled back. "I can learn," he replied. As he walked to his car, James felt something odd stirring in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 6 years, something almost like hope. James Lancaster lived in a world of quarterly results, billion-dollar acquisitions, and board meetings. The people in his orbit were categorized simply useful or disposable. It was a system that worked for him, kept everything organized, predictable, and free of emotional complications. James didn't usually get involved in people's lives. It was a personal rule he had followed meticulously since Lily's disappearance. Emotional distance meant protection. People were unpredictable variables, and unpredictability meant vulnerability. But something about that girl made him break his carefully constructed rules. Maybe it was her big, frightened eyes that seemed to carry too many stories for someone so young. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't asked for anything. No money, no help, no pity. In a world where everyone always wanted something from him, that child simply existed, huddled against a cold wall, expecting nothing. He felt a surge in his chest, an inexplicable urge to protect her, the same kind of impulse he felt when he first held Lily, so small and fragile in his arms. The morning after meeting her, James found himself staring out the window of his 47th floor office, his thoughts drifting back to that alley and to Emily. His assistant had to call his name 3 times before he realized she was there. "Mr. Lancaster, the lawyers are waiting in the conference room." "Cancel," he replied, grabbing his coat. "Tell them I have an emergency." "But sir, it's about the merger." "It can wait until tomorrow," James interrupted, already in the elevator. Half an hour later, he was back at the same alley, with a grocery bag in one hand and, after a last-minute stop, a box of instant mac and cheese in the other. He felt ridiculous. James Lancaster buying boxed macaroni at a regular supermarket like any ordinary person. He hadn't set foot in a place like that in years. His staff handled mundane tasks such as shopping. The alley looked different in daylight, less threatening, more desolate. James spotted from afar the small makeshift camp Emily had pointed out the night before. Someone was there, not the girl, but an older man sitting on a crate, mending what looked like a small coat. "Good morning," James called, keeping a respectful distance. The man looked up, showing no surprise. "You must be that man from the restaurant," he said, returning to his sewing. "Margaret told me about you." "My name is James Lancaster." "Robert," the man responded simply, without extending his hand. He had knobby fingers marked by age and hard work, but his movements with the needle were precise. "Emily is with Margaret, getting water at the park fountain. They'll be back soon." James nodded, unsure of what to do next. "I brought some things," he finally said, raising the bag slightly. Mostly food. Robert studied him for a moment, his faded blue eyes a stark contrast to his weathered skin. He might have been 70, maybe older. Put it over there, he indicated with a nod. And don't take offense, but why are you doing this? The question caught James off guard. Why was he doing this? He had no easy answer. I'm not sure, he admitted. It just feels like the right thing to do. Robert let out a low, raspy laugh. I see. The right thing to do. How many people walk past this alley every day, Mr. Lancaster? Hundreds, thousands. And how many stop to do the right thing? He tied a knot in the thread and bit off the excess. But I'm not complaining. Little Emily wouldn't stop talking about the man with the soft scarf. James felt a strange warmth in his chest at that. Has she been here long? He asked, looking around. The camp was more organized than it first appeared. Plastic tarps were strategically placed to keep out rain, boxes were stacked to block the wind, and blankets were folded neatly. Emily's been with us since she was a baby, Robert replied. Margaret found her. Mr. Lancaster, the child's voice echoed through the alley. Emily came running, her face lighting up with a smile. Behind her was Margaret, carrying a large jug of water. Emily clutched something to her chest, a battered doll James had noticed briefly the night before. You really came back, the girl exclaimed, stopping in front of him. I said I would, James replied, feeling unexpectedly happy to see that small, dirty face lit by a smile. And did you bring the yellow macaroni? Emily asked, peeking into the bags with barely disguised hope. James smiled, showing her the box. Just like I promised. The girl's eyes glowed. She turned to Margaret, who was approaching. See, Margaret, I told you he would bring it. Margaret nodded, her gaze evaluating James cautiously. I see you've met Robert, she said, placing the jug of water on the ground. We were talking, James confirmed. Mr. Lancaster here was asking about Emily, Robert commented. Margaret tensed, almost imperceptibly. Her gaze flicked to Robert for a brief moment before returning to James. What do you want to know about her? She asked, voice controlled. James sensed the change in the air. There was protectiveness in that question, maybe even fear. He raised his hand slightly, in a gesture of peace. Nothing specific. Just curious. Robert mentioned you found her as a baby. Margaret relaxed a bit, though her eyes stayed alert. It was almost 6 years ago, she said, sitting on a crate. I was in Central Park, sleeping on a bench hidden behind some bushes. I woke up to a weak little cry. I thought it was a cat, but it was a baby. No more than a few months old, wrapped in a thin blanket, with that doll by her side. She pointed to the worn toy in Emily's arms. There was no one around. No note, nothing. And you just picked her up? James asked, unable to hide his surprise. Margaret looked at him directly, defiance in her eyes. What would you suggest I should have done? Left her there to freeze or be taken by someone with bad intentions? No, of course not, James hurried to say. I'm just surprised. Many people would have called the police or social services. I've been through the system, Mr. Lancaster, Margaret replied, her voice growing bitter. I grew up in foster homes. Trust me, it's not always better than the streets. She looked at Emily, who was now playing with her doll a few feet away, oblivious to the adults' conversation. And who would believe a homeless woman? They'd probably think I stole her. James nodded, understanding. Suddenly, he felt ashamed of his initial judgment. What you did was admirable, he said sincerely, taking care of a child in these conditions. We do the best we can, Robert intervened. Margaret gets temporary cleaning jobs. I have a small pension. It's not much, but Emily's never gone hungry, and there's always someone watching out for her. James looked at the two of them, this older man with knobby hands and the middle-aged woman with watchful eyes, both skinny, wearing worn clothes, living in an alley, yet pouring everything they had into a child who wasn't theirs by blood but by choice. He was impressed by the love and care this improvised family provided the girl, despite their struggles. It was more than many children got in traditional homes. Have you ever tried to find her biological family? James asked. Margaret and Robert exchanged looks. At first, yes, Margaret said. We asked around, kept an eye on the news about missing babies. But nothing came up, And after a few months, she shrugged. She was already ours. And you named her Emily? Actually, no, Robert said. She was already responding to that name when Margaret found her. There was an E stitched on the blanket. We figured it was Emily or Emma, and she seemed to prefer Emily. James felt a strange chill go through him. Lily wasn't his daughter's official name. It was a nickname he and her mother had chosen. Her actual name, Mr. Lancaster. Margaret interrupted his thoughts. Are you okay? You look pale. I'm fine, he answered automatically. Just touched by your story. In the days that followed, James went back. Once, twice, then nearly every day. He began to learn the routine of this small, improvised family. He found out that Robert had been a history teacher before losing everything to gambling, that Margaret had a knack for storytelling and made Emily laugh with her invented tales about princesses living in cardboard castles and dragons that only ate vegetables. He discovered Emily loved to draw, and that Robert kept every scribble as if it were a masterpiece. He saw how Margaret taught the girl to read using discarded books she found in trash bins near schools. He witnessed the joy in the little one as she learned new words, even though her notebook was made up of stapled blank newspaper sheets. Over time, James started spending more hours with Emily and the others, trying to understand their routines and challenges. He was surprised by how complex life on the streets was, the strategies for getting food, the safe places to sleep, the dangers to avoid. Without making a scene, he started bringing things, first just food and water, then new blankets. A small battery-powered heater, warmer clothing. He made sure to do it discreetly, respecting Robert's pride and Margaret's initial mistrust. It's not charity, he insisted when Margaret protested. It's just sharing. She didn't seem entirely convinced, but accepted for Emily's sake. One afternoon, James arrived with a small art kit, colored pencils, paper, some crayons. Emily's eyes widened as if he had brought a treasure. Is this for me? She asked incredulously. Sure, James replied. I heard you like to draw. The girl picked up a red pencil carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. Can I draw now? It's yours, James smiled. You can use it whenever you like. Emily immediately sat on the ground and started drawing, her tongue poking out at the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. James watched, fascinated by how intensely she threw herself into the task. After a few minutes, she held up the paper proudly. Look, it's us. In the childlike drawing, 4 stick figures smiled, holding hands. A small one with spiky hair, a tall, thin one with long hair, a stooped figure with what seemed to be a cane, and a tall figure in what James recognized as a suit. That's me, Emily pointed to the smallest one. That's Margaret, that's Robert, and that's you. James felt a lump in his throat upon realizing she had included him in the family. It's lovely, Emily, he managed to say. The girl smiled, satisfied, and went back to drawing. Margaret, who had been watching quietly, gave James a look that combined gratitude with something like acceptance. That night, heading back to his empty apartment, James reflected on how much his life had changed in recent weeks. He, who used to live only for work, now found himself rushing through meetings and leaving early just to spend an hour in an alley with people he would once have ignored. He offered to help them more tangibly, maybe an apartment, a fresh start. But Robert and Margaret were firm in their initial refusal. We don't want permanent charity, Margaret explained. And Emily, she's used to us, to living this way. A sudden change could scare her. James respected their decision, but continued to ensure they had access to food, clothing, and a safe place to sleep. He started renting hotel rooms on the coldest nights, insisting it was just temporary until the weather improved. Still, he never imagined how deeply his involvement would change his life. Emily, blissfully unaware of the adults' worries, went about her innocent routines. She played with her battered doll, drew with her new pencils, created stories about clouds shaped like animals, and invented games with stones and leaves she found on the ground. James often found himself watching her, captivated by how someone so young could maintain joy and curiosity despite having so little. She found wonders in what most people would never notice. A colorful bug, the pattern of shadows on the wall, the echo of voices in a nearby tunnel. "Why does the moon follow us when we walk?" she asked one night, as they made their way to a hotel during a forecasted storm. "Well," James began, realizing he didn't know how to explain parallax to a 6-year-old. "It's because it's really, really big and really far away. Kind of like when you see a mountain from a distance. You can walk a lot, but it never seems to move." Emily frowned, thinking hard about that explanation. "So the moon is like a big mountain in the sky?" "Something like that," James smiled. "You know a lot of things," she concluded, impressed. James laughed. "Not as many as I'd like. More than me," Emily insisted. "When I grow up, I want to know as many things as you do." Something about that simple statement touched James deeply. This child, who had no formal schooling and lived in conditions most would find unacceptable, dreamed of knowledge and of learning. Without realizing it, he began to grow truly attached to her and genuinely care about her well-being. It was no longer just a protective impulse or a way to ease his conscience. It was something deeper, more genuine, a bond forming day by day. Each time he looked into those big, curious eyes, something inside him whispered the name he tried not to think, Lily, his lost daughter, who would now be the same age as Emily. The name echoed like a distant whisper, like a secret his heart kept even as his mind tried to silence it. Fall gave way to winter. The dry leaves on the sidewalks were replaced by thin layers of snow that melted during the day and froze at night, turning the streets into slippery traps. The biting cold made street life even harder, and James couldn't stand the thought of Emily enduring negative temperatures at night. After much insistence, and despite initial reluctance from Margaret and Robert, James convinced them to accept more substantial help. He rented a small apartment in a modest neighborhood, nothing luxurious, but clean, safe, and above all, warm. It had 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room, and a small kitchen. For James, it was tiny compared to his penthouse. For Emily and her guardians, it was a palace. "We can't accept this," Margaret protested when James showed them the place. "It's too much." "It's temporary," James insisted, "just until spring. Then you can decide what to do." Robert, always pragmatic, surveyed the apartment critically before nodding slowly. "For the kids' sake," he said, "but we'll pay rent when we can." James agreed, knowing their pride was important to them. They set a symbolic amount Robert insisted on paying with his small pension. Emily, however, didn't hide her joy. She ran from room to room, marveling at the functioning light switches, the hot water from the faucets, and especially the small bedroom that would be hers, the first real bedroom she'd ever had. "Look, Lily," she exclaimed to her worn doll. "We have a real house now." Every day that passed, James grew closer to the girl. His visits to the small apartment became part of his routine. He came by after work, bringing groceries, educational toys, or just to spend a few hours in the company of this improvised family who were filling a void in his life he no longer knew how to name. Emily always greeted him with enthusiasm, running to the door as soon as she heard his signature knock. To his surprise, James discovered he enjoyed things he had never valued before. Helping Emily with the basic lessons Margaret had begun teaching her, playing second-hand board games, or simply sitting at the table for a simple meal prepared by Robert, who turned out to be a resourceful cook despite limited ingredients. On a particularly clear night, James took Emily to the rooftop of the building. It wasn't very tall, just 6 floors, but offered a decent view of the city lights. The sky was clear, and a few brighter stars managed to pierce the metropolis's light pollution. "Wow," Emily whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the urban panorama. "It looks magical." James smiled, seeing the city through her eyes. The building lights, the moving cars, the bright signs, all took on new meaning when seen through Emily's childlike wonder. "When I was as little as you," James said, "my father used to take me to the roof of our house on weekends. We couldn't see much of the city from there, but the stars, they were amazing." "Was your dad nice?" Emily asked, always curious about James's life, which he rarely talked about. James thought for a moment. "Sometimes he worked a lot, just like I do. But when he was home, he tried to make up for lost time." "What about your mom?" "She died when I was young." "I'm sorry," Emily said, with a seriousness beyond her years. I think mine did too. James looked at her, surprised at how directly she spoke about her likely orphanhood. Margaret told me she found me alone, Emily went on, tracing patterns in the thin layer of snow on the ledge. So I guess my mum died, or maybe she didn't want me. She shrugged with a resignation that broke James's heart. Sometimes things aren't that simple, he said carefully. Emily looked at him, waiting for him to go on. James hadn't planned to open up. The words just slipped out, as if an internal dam had burst after years of pressure. I had a daughter, he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. She would be your age now, but someone took her from me when she was still a baby. Since then, I've never seen her again. The silence that followed was almost tangible. James kept his eyes on the city lights, unable to face Emily. He hadn't talked about Lily to anyone in years, not to therapists, not to the police who eventually gave up the case, not even to himself in his loneliest moments. Emily said nothing for several seconds. Then, in a simple, natural gesture, she reached out and held James's hand. It was a brief touch, almost fleeting, but so charged with understanding and empathy that James felt his heart warm, melting some of the ice that had encased it for so long. Maybe someday you'll find her, Emily said finally, with the simple hope only a child could offer. James swallowed hard, unable to respond. How could he explain to a 6-year-old the pain of a loss that never healed? How could he talk about investigations that led nowhere, about years of waiting without results, about hope destroyed again and again? Maybe, was all he could say. That night, driving back to his empty apartment, James realized how much he'd just revealed to Emily. Somehow that little girl had the key to a compartment in his heart that had been locked for years. In the following weeks, James stepped up his assistance to Emily's family. He provided new, proper winter clothes, warm coats, waterproof boots, gloves, and hats. He stocked their kitchen with groceries, made sure there was always nutritious food in the fridge and cupboards. He hired a discreet doctor to give them checkups, especially Emily, who had never received proper medical care. To his surprise, Margaret and Robert started accepting his help with less resistance. Maybe they realized James's generosity wasn't out of pity or a sense of superiority, but genuine affection that had grown among them all. Robert, in particular, seemed to have formed an unlikely friendship with James. The two men, so different in their life paths, discovered a common interest in chess. Robert had been a skilled player back in his teaching days, and James enjoyed the challenge of playing someone who had no fear of beating him, rare in his professional circle, where people always seemed keen to please him. Margaret, ever cautious, kept a certain distance, but James could see her attitude toward him had softened. She accepted his presence and had even begun consulting him about practical matters, such as the possibility of Emily attending school once spring arrived. His relationship with Emily, meanwhile, continued to blossom. He discovered in himself a patience and kindness he'd never known before. Emily awakened in him a sense of wonder at small things. A bird at the window, a perfect snowflake, the pattern light made through a curtain. Gradually, they built a bridge over the gulf between their worlds. Sometimes James imagined what it would be like if Emily were truly his daughter, if somehow she were Lily, miraculously returned. The idea was as painful as it was comforting. It happened during one of those carefree afternoons, while they were playing in the small living room. Emily was building a tower with colorful blocks James had brought. It was warm in the apartment, and she wore just a short-sleeved t-shirt Margaret had found among donated clothes. James was sitting on the floor next to her, handing her blocks as she asked for them. Emily stretched to reach a particularly distant red block. As she did, her shirt slipped a bit off her left shoulder, revealing something that made James's heart race. A small birthmark. It wouldn't mean much to most people, just a tiny reddish patch, slightly raised, the size of a small coin. But to James, it was as if the world had stopped turning for an instant. He held his breath. It was the same mark Lily had, in the exact same spot, on the upper left shoulder, near the collarbone, a mark vaguely shaped like a half-moon or a small comma, a mark James knew like the back of his hand, because he used to kiss it every night before laying his baby daughter down to sleep in the few months they had together. Shock hit him with the force of an electric current. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might leap out of his throat. His hands began to tremble slightly. "James, are you okay?" Emily's voice seemed far away, muffled by the roar of blood in his ears. She was staring at him, concerned, her head tilted in a gesture that now, he realized, was exactly like Claire's, the mother of Lily. "I'm fine," he managed, forcing himself to breathe normally. "I just remembered something I have to do later." Emily shrugged and went back to her tower, unaware of the emotional storm raging inside him. He held himself together with superhuman effort. His mind raced, evaluating the possibilities. Coincidence? How many children had birthmarks? Millions, probably. And how many had exactly this one, in that exact location? And how many of those would be exactly the same age Lily would be now? And how many had been found abandoned just months after his daughter's disappearance? The math of coincidence made it almost impossible. Unless... James watched Emily play, observing her movements and expressions. Now that his mind was connecting the dots, he began noticing similarities he might have missed before. The shape of her eyes, though the color was different, the way she furrowed her brow when concentrating, the little crooked smile when she was particularly pleased with something. Or was he just seeing what he desperately wanted to see? He couldn't jump to conclusions. He needed absolute certainty before letting himself hope. He had faced too many disappointments in the past 6 years, tips that led nowhere, sightings that turned out to be mistakes, hopes crushed time after time. As he watched Emily quietly hum while stacking blocks, James made a decision. He would do a DNA test. It was the only way to be sure. He wouldn't tell Margaret or Robert yet. He didn't want to raise unnecessary hopes or fears. The test would be done discreetly, without Emily knowing. The idea of collecting Emily's genetic material without her knowledge bothered him ethically, but his need to know the truth outweighed his qualms. If she really was Lily, if by some inexplicable miracle his daughter had returned to him, James shook his head, forcing himself not to get carried away by hope. He would proceed methodically, scientifically. He had contacts and could ensure the test would be fast and discreet. "Look, James, I'm done," Emily exclaimed, pointing to her tower, now as tall as her own chest. "It's amazing, Emily," he said, forcing himself to focus on the present. "You're very talented." She smiled, that crooked smile that now struck him like a revelation. "Let's show Margaret and Robert when they come back." "Sure," James agreed, helping her steady a wobbly block. For the rest of the afternoon, he remained physically present but mentally far away, planning, calculating, hoping against all odds. That night, after saying goodbye to Emily and her guardians, James drove to his office instead of going home. The building was nearly empty at that hour, just a few night shift staff and cleaning crews. In his private office, he opened his laptop and began researching, first, potential DNA testing methods, then reputable and discreet labs. Finally, contacts in the police department who had worked on Lily's case. He'd need her genetic profile on file for comparison. As he worked, a small object on the corner of his desk caught his eye. A drawing by Emily, a colorful image of 4 stick figures holding hands, with "My Family" written at the top in wobbly letters. James, Margaret, Roberts and Emily, all united by a child's crayon strokes. Unexpected tears blurred his vision. What would happen to this little family if Emily really was Lily? What would happen to Margaret and Robert, who had cared for her all these years with so little? What would happen to James himself, who had devoted his life to searching for a child who might have been beside him all this time? He wiped his eyes and got back to work. Questions for later. First, the truth. The rest would follow. The next morning, James called his personal physician, a discreet man who had been treating him for years and respected his privacy. "I need your help with a delicate matter," James explained, without giving too many details about his suspicions. "A private DNA test." The doctor nodded, used to the sometimes eccentric requests of wealthy clients. "I can arrange that. He'll need samples from both parties, of course. One sample should already be in the system. Lily Lancaster, missing for 6 years. The case was widely publicized." The doctor looked at him with surprise, but remained professional. I see. And the other sample? I'll get it, James replied. How long until we have results? With the right contacts and proper incentives, we can have a preliminary answer in 48 hours. Full results in a week. James nodded. Make it happen. 2 days later, after a visit to the apartment where Emily now lived, James left with a hairbrush containing several strands of light brown hair. The guilt over this furtive act was overshadowed by the desperate need to know the truth. Now, it was just a matter of waiting and dealing with the possibility that his life and Emily's could change forever in a few days. The 3 days following the DNA collection were the longest of James's life. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour a day. Time had taken on an elastic, torturous quality, giving him the sense of being stuck in limbo. That morning, he looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The deep circles under his eyes told of sleepless nights filled with dreams and nightmares. Lily, Emily, endless corridors where he chased a child he could never catch. His unshaven face, something unthinkable for James Lancaster under normal circumstances, gave him a disheveled appearance that matched how he felt inside. He went through his daily routine, meetings, phone calls, business decisions, but everything seemed to happen at a great distance, like he was watching his own life through frosted glass. Sitting at the head of the conference table, he realized he had completely lost track of the discussion. Executives were looking at him, waiting for a response he didn't have. "Mr. Lancaster," his vice president repeated, "about the merger proposal." "Let's review the numbers again," he answered automatically, stalling. "I want detailed reports on my desk by tomorrow." The concerned looks exchanged among his staff did not go unnoticed. His assistant asked if he was ill when he cancelled his 3rd meeting in a row. In a sense, he was ill with hope, a more debilitating condition than anything he'd ever experienced. "Just tired, Diane," he said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." James visited Emily, Margaret, and Robert as usual, trying to act normally. It was harder than he'd imagined. Each time he looked at Emily, he saw new signs, new similarities. The way she tilted her head when curious, just like Claire, Lily's mother. The way her nose wrinkled when she laughed. The single dimple that appeared only on the right side of her face. The slight habit of biting her lower lip when concentrating, something James himself had done since childhood. Or was he imagining it all, seeing patterns where none existed, like people who see faces in clouds or messages in random coincidences? "James? Are you listening to me?" Emily's voice brought him back to reality. They were sitting at the small kitchen table, with a board game spread out. Colorful pieces were scattered on the board, some already captured by Emily. She was winning, and he hadn't even noticed. "Sorry, honey. I'm a bit distracted today." He moved a piece randomly, without strategy. "Are you sad?" she asked, with that perceptiveness that sometimes surprised James. Her big eyes studied him intently, as if searching for clues in a puzzle. "No, I'm not sad. I'm just thinking about a lot of things." James tried to smile, but he felt it come out more like a grimace. Emily considered his reply for a moment, her large eyes taking in his features as if reading him like a book. "Things about your daughter." The question hit him like a punch. James felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment, he thought she knew, that somehow Emily had guessed what he suspected. But no, that was impossible. She had simply noticed his odd behavior and connected it with the story he told her. "Why do you ask?" His voice sounded more strained than he intended. Emily shrugged, moving her piece on the board and capturing another of his. She moved without hurry, naturally, unaware of the earthquake her words caused. "Your eyes get different when you think about her. Kind of wet, kind of far away, like you're looking at something no one else can see." James swallowed hard. Even unknowingly, she saw right through him with stunning clarity. It was that kind of pure intuition that had drawn him to her in the first place, an untainted insight only children have. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I'm thinking about her. I hope you find her someday," Emily said matter-of-factly, then smiled, a crooked smile, slightly deeper on the right side, just like his. How had he not noticed before? "It's your turn to play." James moved a piece thoughtlessly, leaving it open. Emily immediately captured it, letting out a little cry of triumph. Margaretine, who was preparing dinner at the small stove, glanced over with a tired smile. "She's wiping the floor with you, Mr. Lancaster," she commented. "You might want to pay more attention." "James," he corrected automatically. Even after weeks of contact, Margaret still used that formality, one of the few remaining barriers he respected but hoped to overcome someday. "And yes, she's very good at this. Robert taught me," Emily explained proudly. "He says board games teach us to think ahead." James nodded, thinking how Robert, despite his limited circumstances, maintained a practical wisdom no university could teach. The way he cared for Emily, teaching her life lessons through games and stories, was admirable. On the morning of the fourth day, James's phone rang. He was in his office, trying and failing to focus on financial reports. When he saw the number, he almost dropped his coffee cup. It was his doctor. "Mr. Lancaster, we have the preliminary results." James felt his heart race. His hands went cold and clammy, and a strange tingling ran through his fingers. He closed his office door, even though he was alone on that floor so early in the morning. "And?" His voice came out strangled, almost unrecognizable. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause that felt like an eternity. James could hear his own breathing, quick and shallow, as he waited. "The genetic markers match, Mr. Lancaster. I can say with 99.9% certainty that the sample you provided belongs to your biological daughter." The world stopped. James couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The words echoed in his mind, but felt unreal, as though he were hearing them in a dream. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself, his legs suddenly weak. "Mr. Lancaster, are you still there?" "Yes," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you absolutely sure?" "Science is clear. The full results will come in a few days, but I expect no changes." The multiple markers analyzed, the match at critical DNA loci. The child from whom you took the sample is, without a doubt, your biological daughter. After hanging up, James stood frozen in his office for nearly an hour. Silent tears streamed down his face as a storm of emotions raged within him: joy, shock, relief, guilt, fear. Emily was Lily. Lily was Emily. His daughter, whom he thought lost forever, had been by his side for weeks. Years of searching, thousands of dollars spent on private investigators, rewards offered, sleepless nights, and in the end, a chance encounter in an alley had brought his daughter back to him. For a fleeting moment, it seemed too absurd to be true. What were the odds that, after 6 years of searching, he would simply stumble upon his missing daughter in an alley a few blocks from where he used to dine? Statistically, it was almost impossible, but somehow, it wasn't a coincidence. Fate, paternal instinct, or just benevolent chance had led him to her, and now, his life would never be the same. The following days were almost unbearable with anxiety. James observed Emily from a distance, every smile, every gesture, every word increasing his doubt and hope. Could it really be? Could this sweet, intelligent, resilient child be his Lily? The test said yes, but his heart still swung between believing in a miracle and fearing a devastating disappointment. He took her to a park near the apartment, watching as she ran on the grass, the sun lighting her hair, the same shade of brownish gold Claire had. How her laughter sounded like music, free and unrestrained. How, when she looked at him after sliding down, her smile contained all the brightness in the universe. "You're looking at me like that again," she said, approaching him on the bench where he sat. "Like what?" he asked, offering her some water from a bottle. "Like you're trying to draw me in your head," she replied, taking a long gulp. A trickle of water ran down her chin, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. A gesture so childlike, so innocent, it made James's heart clench. He smiled. "Maybe I am." Emily sat beside him, her legs swinging because they didn't reach the ground. "Margaret says we have to leave the apartment soon." James frowned, surprised. "Why?" "She said we can't stay forever. That you've already done too much and that—" She hesitated, searching for the exact words. It's not right to take advantage of your generosity. James made a mental note to speak with Margaret about that. There was no deadline for leaving the apartment. He wanted them to stay as long as necessary, especially now that he knew the truth. Don't worry about that, Emily. You can stay as long as you need. She smiled, looking relieved. Can I tell you a secret? Sure, he replied, leaning in to hear her. I've never had a bed that was just mine before, she whispered, as if confessing something forbidden. It's the best thing in the world. James felt a lump in his throat. Things most children took for granted, a bed, a bedroom, safety, were extraordinary luxuries for Emily. And he, who could have provided all that and more, had never been there. The lost years weighed on him like a mountain. When the final results arrived, confirming what he already knew, James decided it was time to act. He could no longer live in this limbo, aware of the truth while Emily, Margaret, and Robert remained in the dark. He began planning how to tell them all. 1,000 scenarios ran through his head, from the most dramatic to the gentlest approaches. In the end, he decided direct honesty was best. James decided that before telling Emily, he had to speak with Margaret and Robert. They had been her family for years, caring for her when he hadn't known where to look. They deserved to know first and help decide how to tell the child. He arranged a meeting for a time when Emily would be at the small neighborhood library, attending a free children's reading hour, an activity he had encouraged her to join. The library was only a couple of blocks from the apartment, and Margaret would pick her up after an hour. That afternoon, James arrived at the apartment with a heavy heart. He knew he was about to change everyone's life forever. He carried a folder containing the test results, photos of Lily as a baby, and newspaper clippings of her disappearance, evidence that might be needed to convince them. Margaret and Robert greeted him with the cautious familiarity that had developed between them. Something in James's expression must have revealed his seriousness, because both looked tense from the moment he walked in. Did something happen? Margaret asked bluntly, ever perceptive. Her eyes, tired yet sharp, studied his face as if reading his thoughts. James took a deep breath. How to explain the inexplicable? I need to tell you something, he began, sitting at the small kitchen table where they'd shared meals, where Emily did her drawings, where Robert taught her board games, something that will change everything. Robert and Margaret exchanged worried looks before sitting too. Robert, always calmer, rested his elbows on the table, hands clasped as if in prayer. It's about Emily, James continued, his voice trembling despite his effort to keep it steady. He looked at his own hands for a moment, mustering courage, then met their eyes. I found out something I don't even know how to begin to explain. What kind of thing? Robert asked, his voice rough with anxiety. James closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, looking directly at the two. Emily is my daughter, he finally said. My biological daughter, the one who was kidnapped 6 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret visibly paled, her hands gripping the table edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Robert seemed frozen, his face a mask of shock. For a moment, no one breathed, as if time had stopped in that tiny kitchen. That's impossible, Margaret finally whispered, her voice shaking. There must be some mistake. I thought so too, James replied gently, understanding their shock. When I first suspected, I thought I was going crazy, seeing things that weren't there out of desperation. He paused. But I did a DNA test. There's no doubt Emily is Lily, my daughter. A DNA test? Margaret's voice rose an octave, shock giving way to indignation. How could you do that without our permission, without us knowing, without Emily knowing? James felt the weight of his guilt. The method he'd used to find the truth now felt invasive, almost predatory. I took some hair from her brush, he admitted, unable to meet Margaret's eyes. I know I shouldn't have done it without telling you, but I had to be certain before causing any confusion. Confusion, Margaret repeated, the word charged with emotion. Her hands trembled slightly. Is that what you call what you're doing? Creating confusion. Robert placed a hand on Margaret's arm, his face now serious. He was always the peacemaker, the rational one. Let him explain, he said calmly. although James could see he too struggled to maintain composure. "How do you know Emily is your daughter? What was her name? When did she disappear exactly?" In a tense and emotional conversation, James laid out the whole truth. How his daughter, whose legal name was Claire, but whom he and her mother affectionately called Lily, had vanished from his apartment when she was only 8 months old. How the nanny had been found unconscious, attacked by whoever took the child. How investigations had led nowhere despite media coverage and a substantial reward. How he never fully gave up hope, though it waned with each passing day. He opened the folder, showing them photos, Claire as a baby, curious eyes and a tuft of brown hair. Newspaper clippings with headlines like "Business Tycoon's Daughter Disappears" and $1 million reward offered for information on kidnapped infant. And, finally, the DNA results with its technical language and unmistakable conclusion. "Her birthmark," James said, his voice thick with emotion. The tiny half-moon-shaped spot on Emily's left shoulder. That was the first thing that made me suspect. Lily had the exact same mark, in the exact same place. Margaret stared at the photos with growing comprehension and horror. Robert scanned the newspaper clippings, his eyes racing over the words as though looking for some contradiction, some sign that this was all a mistake. "Her doll," James continued, feeling the need to present all the evidence at once. "The doll she calls Lily, that was her own name. The nickname Claire and I gave her. The doll was in the crib the day she was taken. Whoever took her let her keep the doll. And somehow, even though she was so young, she remembered the name." Margaret covered her mouth with her hands, tears now freely streaming down her face. Robert stared into space, processing everything. The clock ticked relentlessly on the wall, the only sound besides heavy breathing. "I always knew she belonged to someone," Margaret said at last, between sobs. Her hands shook as she took a handkerchief from her pocket. "A baby so small, so well cared for. I knew it wasn't just an ordinary abandonment. The clothes she wore were decent quality, even if plain. I looked for you," she added, wiping tears. "In those first months, I looked for news about missing children. I asked around, checked newspapers whenever I could. But I had no internet, no TV. I lived on the streets, Mr. Lancaster. My connection to the world was limited." James nodded, understanding. Lily's case was nationally reported, but for someone living on the margins, with no steady access to media, it would be easy to miss. Especially since the story focused on New York and its surrounding areas, never assuming the child had been taken elsewhere. "I'm not blaming you," he assured them, placing his hand on the table without touching theirs. "Quite the opposite. You saved my daughter. You cared for her when I couldn't. You gave her love, protection, an education with what little you had. I'll always be grateful, if not for you." He couldn't finish, the possibilities too dark to say aloud. Robert finally spoke, his voice weary. "What do you plan to do now, Mr. Lancaster?" The question hung in the air, laden with meaning. What would happen to Emily, to the improvised family that was all she remembered? Would there be legal battles, forced separation, trauma? "I want Emily to know the truth," James answered honestly. "I want her to know she's my daughter, that she wasn't abandoned but taken from me, that she was loved and searched for all this time." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But also, I know you're her family, the only parents she remembers. I don't want to take that from her. I don't want to cause more trauma than she's already suffered." Margaret looked up, surprised. "You're saying you won't take her? You won't fight for custody?" Her voice held a mixture of hope and disbelief, as though she couldn't trust what she was hearing. James took a deep breath, facing the question that had tortured him in recent days. "I'm saying I want what's best for Emily Claire," he corrected himself, the name still unfamiliar after so long. "And I believe that ripping her away from you would be cruel, traumatic. You're the only stable parental figure she knows. She loves you." He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "Legally, I know I have rights to her. I'm her biological father, and she was kidnapped, not abandoned. But I don't want a legal battle that would hurt Emily most of all." He looked at Margaret and Robert, aware of the depth of their love for his daughter. "I want us to find a middle ground, an arrangement where Emily can know me as her father, where I can be part of her life without cutting off her ties to you." A thoughtful silence filled the kitchen. Outside, life went on. Cars passing, people talking, the distant rumble of a truck. But inside that small apartment, 3 adults faced one of the hardest decisions of their lives. Robert broke the silence first, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Lancaster and James, I won't pretend I understand everything you're feeling. Losing a daughter, searching for her for years, then finding her like this. Most people can't imagine that." He paused, looking at Margaret before continuing. "But I can say that what you're proposing, this generosity, isn't what most people would do in your place." "Robert's right," Margaret added, her voice still trembling but steadier. "You could just take Emily from us. You have the money, the power, the law on your side. The fact that you're here talking to us, proposing an arrangement—" She trailed off, unable to continue. "How do we tell her?" Margaret finally asked, implicitly accepting that the truth needed to be revealed. "Honestly," Robert answered before James could speak, "Emily, Claire, deserves to know who she is, where she came from, that she wasn't abandoned but loved and searched for." James nodded, grateful for the old man's wisdom. "We can tell her together," he suggested. "All of us, like a family." The word lingered in the air, family. A new definition was forming in that simple kitchen among people brought together by fate in the most unlikely way. That afternoon, when Emily returned from the library, bursting with stories of the book she'd discovered, the 3 adults had a plan. They would wait for the right moment, perhaps the next day, when she was rested and everyone had time to process. They'd reveal the truth simply, appropriately for her age, emphasizing how loved she was by everyone. But life rarely follows perfect plans. That same evening, while Emily helped Margaret wash the dinner dishes, she suddenly asked, "Why is everyone acting so weird today?" The 3 adults exchanged glances. James's heart pounded. Margaret nearly dropped the plate she was drying. "Weird how, honey?" Margaret asked, trying to buy time. "Everyone's talking in hushed voices and stopping when I come in," Emily replied, sharp as ever. "And James kept looking at me all through dinner like I was going to disappear." She frowned anxiously. "Are you mad at me?" "No!" the 3 exclaimed in unison, perhaps too quickly. "No, darling, no one's mad at you," Margaret assured her, kneeling to be at her eye level. "It's just that we have something important to talk to you about." Another round of glances went around, and James realized the moment had come, whether they liked it or not. "Emily," he began, also kneeling, "we have something really important to tell you. It might feel confusing at first, but it's good. Surprising, but good." The girl dried her hands on a small apron, her expression serious. Her big eyes shifted from one adult to the next, trying to read them. "Is it bad?" Her voice was small, fearful. "No," James answered quickly, feeling a need to quell her fear. "It's not bad, it's different. Surprising." Emily looked at Margaret and Robert, who stepped closer, forming a small circle around her. Robert placed a protective, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember I told you about my daughter?" James asked gently. "The one who was taken from me when she was a baby?" Emily nodded, her eyes locked on his. "Tayo said you never saw her again." "Yes," James confirmed, feeling his throat tighten. "Her name was Claire, but her mother and I called her Lily." He paused to let that sink in. "Like your doll?" Emily frowned, glancing at her beloved rag doll, which sat on the couch in the small living room. "Yes, my doll is named Lily." "Emily," Margaret interjected, her voice trembling but determined, "do you remember how I told you I found you, when you were just a baby?" The girl nodded. She knew the story well, how Margaret found her on a park bench, alone except for her doll and a thin blanket. "I were alone on a bench with that doll." "Emily," James continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, fighting back overwhelming emotion, "you're Claire. You're my daughter." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Emily's expression shifted between confusion, shock, and something like fear. She took a small step back, instinctively moving closer to Margaret, who placed her hands protectively on Emily's shoulders. How?" she finally asked, her voice small and unsure. James fought the urge to pull her into a hug. Instead, he stayed where he was, giving her space to process. "Someone took you from me when you were very little," he explained, simplifying for a 6-year-old's understanding. "I searched for you for a long time, but I couldn't find you. And then, by a miracle, a lucky chance, I found you in that alley, without knowing it was you." "But how do you know it's me, your daughter?" Emily asked, the confusion obvious in her voice. It was a lot to process, especially at her age. Gently, with pauses to answer her questions and offer comfort, the 3 adults explained everything. How Emily had been born, Claire Lancaster. How someone had taken her from her father at just 8 months old. How Margaret, unaware of her true identity, found her a few weeks later. How, through an extraordinary coincidence, James discovered her again in that alley so many years later. "The mark on your shoulder," James said, "is the same one Claire, you, had as a baby. That's how I first began to suspect. Then I did a special test that proves you're my daughter." Emily touched her shoulder as though feeling the birthmark through her shirt. In the weeks after the discovery, James proposed a new arrangement. Emily would continue living with Margaret and Robert in the apartment he had rented, but would spend 2 days a week at his penthouse so they could get to know each other better. At first, Margaret or Robert accompanied her, but gradually Emily began visiting by herself. James's apartment was a completely different world from anything Emily had known. The mirrored elevators, the uniformed doorman, the silent marble hallways. It was all like something out of a movie. The first time she walked into the penthouse, she froze at the door, stunned by the vastness of the space and the panoramic view of the city. "Is this whole place yours?" she asked, eyes wide, taking in the living room that was larger than the entire apartment where she lived with Margaret and Robert. "It is," James answered, watching her reaction with a mix of pride and discomfort. Suddenly, his opulent home felt excessive, almost obscene when viewed by a child who had grown up with almost nothing. Emily began visiting regularly. James tried everything to please her. He set up a dream bedroom any child would love, with shelves of books, educational toys, and a bed shaped like a castle. He hired a chef to prepare her favorite meals. He took her to amusement parks, zoos, children's museums. But despite the luxuries and attention, James noticed something missing. Emily would smile and say thank you, taking part in the activities, but there was a reserve in her manner, a hesitation he couldn't break through. In the early days, she refused to sleep alone in the new room, preferring a small couch near the guest room, where Margaret sometimes stayed overnight. She barely touched the gourmet meals, asking instead for simple mac and cheese or sandwiches. And inevitably, by the end of the second day, Emily would start checking the clock, anxious to go home. "Don't you like being here?" James asked once, trying to hide the hurt in his voice. Emily bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. Even at her young age, she seemed worried about hurting his feelings. "I do," she finally said. "It's pretty, but it doesn't feel real." James frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean it doesn't feel real?" Emily shrugged, looking around at the impeccably decorated living room, the expensive artwork, the sofas that seemed never to have been used. "It feels like a pretend house, like a museum. Nobody really lives here." Her observation struck James like a punch. It was true. Despite all its luxury, his apartment was merely a place he slept and sometimes worked. It wasn't a home. It lacked the warmth, the smell of home-cooked meals, the organized chaos of personal items that Margaret and Robert's small apartment had. James recognized Emily's hesitation and understood he had to give her time. The child psychologist he'd consulted repeated that at every session. Be patient. Building a relationship takes time, especially for a child who's been through so much. Meanwhile, Margaret and Robert behaved with a dignity James couldn't help admiring. They encouraged Emily to get to know her biological father better, helping her get ready for visits, listening to her stories when she returned. They never said a negative word about him, though James suspected they had every reason to resent him. "She's confused," Margaret explained one afternoon, after Emily had gone shopping for groceries with Robert. "Try to understand, her entire life has just been turned upside down, finding out she's not who she thought she was." "But you've both been incredible," James said, genuinely impressed by their generosity. Margaret smiled sadly. "We love Emily more than anything, and part of loving her is knowing when to step back." She paused. "We'll never stop reminding her that we love her no matter what." Her words stayed with James for days. Their love for Emily was unconditional, with no expectations of reciprocity. He wondered if he could be equally generous if the roles were reversed. One evening, after a tense day in which Emily refused to try on the new clothes he'd bought, he ended up taking her back earlier than usual. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by traffic noise. "Are you mad at me?" Emily finally asked, her voice small. James glanced at her, surprised. "Of course not. Why would I be mad? Because I didn't like the clothes." She was staring at her hands knotted in her lap. "They were pretty, but they didn't feel like me." "I'm not mad," he assured her. "I just want you to be happy." "Everyone keeps saying that," Emily muttered, "that they want me to be happy. But no one asks what really makes me happy." Her words echoed in James's mind for the rest of the night, long after he'd dropped her off. Back in his empty penthouse, he realized he might be trying to buy her love, to make up for lost years with lavish gifts and outings, instead of simply listening to what she truly wanted. He had no idea Emily would make a drastic decision that same night. Around 2 a.m, James's phone rang. It was Margaret, her voice trembling with panic. "Emily's gone," she said without preamble. "We checked her bed, and she's not here. The bedroom window is open." James felt his blood run cold. "I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, he arrived at the apartment. Robert had already gone out to search the surrounding area. Margaret paced back and forth, wringing her hands. "She took her doll and some clothes," Margaret explained, showing James the small closet in Emily's room, now with empty spaces. "And she took food from the fridge. She must have planned this." James tried to remain calm, though his heart pounded. His daughter, lost once, then miraculously found, was missing again. "I'll call the police," he said, picking up his phone. "No," Margaret interrupted. "At least not yet. If the police get involved, they'll question how she was in our care, why we don't have adoption papers. They might even put her into the system once she's found." James hesitated. Margaret was right. Emily's legal situation was complicated. He hadn't formally re-established his parental rights, preferring to give everyone time to adjust. "We have to find her ourselves," Margaret insisted. "She can't have gone far. I know a few places she might hide." James agreed, and the two headed into the cold night to search, united in their mission. As he drove, James called his contacts, private security personnel, ex-police officers he had hired when searching for Lily. In minutes, a small network was activated, all looking for a 6-year-old girl clutching a rag doll. During the frantic search, James stopped by his office to retrieve a file with recent photos of Emily, anything that might help. While rummaging through his desk, he found a folder he hadn't opened in years, the original police report on Lily's disappearance. Impulsively, he opened it, skimming the yellowed pages. Something jumped out at him, an overlooked detail or something he hadn't grasped before. The investigator had noted that the apartment's security system had been disabled by someone who knew the code. There were no signs of forced entry. And the nanny, before being attacked, had let someone in whom she apparently recognized. The report suggested Lily's disappearance was no random act. Someone close to James might have been involved. James felt a wave of nausea. If that was true, it meant that all these years he could have been interacting with the person who orchestrated his daughter's kidnapping, someone he trusted enough to have access to his home and his life. But this was no time to investigate that lead. Emily was missing, and finding her was the priority. After 3 fruitless hours, James's phone rang. It was Robert. "I think I know where she might be," the old man said, voice weary. "The alley, our old spot." James understood immediately. The same alley where it all began, where he had found Emily for the first time. It made sense she'd go back there, a place that represented safety in her memory. 15 minutes later, James arrived. The area looked smaller, darker than he remembered. Cautiously, he ventured into the alley, his heart pounding. And there she was, curled up in the same corner where he'd found her months ago, hugging her doll, asleep on a small makeshift blanket. The relief he felt was so overwhelming his legs nearly gave out. He approached quietly, not wanting to scare her. "Emily," he called gently. She woke instantly, her eyes wide with fear until she recognized him. Then, to his surprise, she began to cry. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. I don't know who I am anymore." James sat beside her, not touching her yet, giving her space. "Why did you run away?" he asked softly. After a moment's hesitation, Emily confessed she ran away because she was afraid of losing the only family she knew. She was afraid James would eventually take her away from Margaret and Robert, that she'd have to choose between them. "Are you afraid to live with me?" James asked, unable to hide the hurt in his voice. Emily bit her lip, nodding timidly. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered, "but Margaret and Robert are my family. They took care of me my whole life." With patience, James assured her she would never have to choose between him and her adoptive parents, that they could form a different kind of family, but a family nonetheless. He promised not to rush her, not to force her to adapt more quickly than she felt ready. "Promise you won't take me away?" she asked, her eyes pleading. "I promise," James replied without hesitation. "We'll figure this out together." As he drove Emily back home, James thought about the clue he'd discovered in the file. In addition to rebuilding his relationship with his daughter, he also needed to figure out what really happened 6 years earlier. Who orchestrated Lily's disappearance, and why? His instincts told him a former associate of the family, Victor Rhodes, might have been involved. The man had left the company abruptly after the kidnapping, citing health problems, but James had always doubted his motives, but that was an investigation for another time. Now, his daughter was safe, and that was all that mattered. 3 days passed since Emily's flight, 3 days during which she barely spoke, replying only in monosyllables when addressed. She had returned to James's home as scheduled, but something fundamental had changed. The fear she felt that night in the alley had turned into an invisible wall between her and the world. James stood in the doorway of the bedroom he'd prepared for her, watching his daughter perched on the edge of the huge bed, legs swinging above the floor, clutching her doll as if it were an anchor in a stormy sea. Her gaze was fixed on the skyline beyond the window, but James knew she wasn't really seeing the skyscrapers or the blue sky. She was lost in thoughts no 6-year-old should have. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. Emily nodded without looking at him. James entered and sat in the chair near the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "Margaret called," he said. "She and Robert miss you. They asked if they could come here for dinner tonight." For the first time in days, Emily's eyes lit up. She turned to him, a spark of hope on her face. "They can really come?" "Of course," James replied. "Actually, I was thinking maybe they can come over whenever you want, or we can visit them, whatever you prefer." Emily frowned, confused. "But didn't you say I need to learn how to live here? That this is my real home now?" James felt the weight of those words. He realized how his well-meant attempts to establish a routine had sounded like ultimatums to a child who'd already endured so many changes. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words coming more easily than he expected. "Your home is wherever you feel safe and loved. It could be here with me, with Margaret and Robert, or both." He moved a bit closer, still carefully. "Emily, after you left that night, I realized a lot of things, mainly that I'm trying to make everything happen too fast, on my terms. I'm not really listening to what you need." The girl studied him with those large, serious eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Were you scared when I ran away?" "More than you could imagine," James answered honestly. "I thought I'd lost you again." "Were Margaret and Robert scared too?" "Very much, we all were." Emily lowered her eyes, ashamed. "I didn't mean to scare anyone. I just wanted to understand things." James nodded. He understood that need perfectly, the desire for control in a world that felt like it was collapsing. "I know, and I promise we'll do things differently from now on, together." That night, James's rarely used high-tech kitchen was filled with life. Margaret brought ingredients and started cooking mac and cheese, Emily's favorite dish. Robert told stories while setting the table, his knobby hands arranging forks and knives with almost ceremonial care. James opened a bottle of wine for the adults, while Emily hovered around helping here and there, slowly finding her way back to her natural joy. It was unlike any dinner James had ever had in his home. There was no formality of business dinners, no superficiality of social events. It was simpler, infinitely more precious, a family gathered, imperfect and unconventional, but a family all the same. When Emily finally fell asleep, tired after a day that began in silence and ended in laughter, the three adults gathered in the living room. The contrast among them couldn't have been greater. James in casual clothes that still cost more than a month's rent in Margaret and Robert's old place, Margaret in a faded but immaculately clean sweater, Robert with his time-worn hands that had known hard work his entire life. Yet there was an equality among them at that moment, their love for Emily. "I've realized that to gain her trust, I have to let you be a part of her new life," James said eventually, breaking the silence. "Not just as occasional visitors, but as a constant presence." Margaret and Robert exchanged surprised glances. "What exactly are you proposing?" Robert asked, cautious. James took a deep breath. In the last few days, as he worried about Emily's silence, he'd thought a lot about this. "There's an apartment available 2 floors down, 3 bedrooms, a view of the park. I'd like you to consider making it your new home." The surprise was clear on their faces. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it, speechless. We can't accept something like that," she finally said. "Think of it as a loan if you want," James insisted, "or maybe a trade. Robert, I know you used to teach history. There are private schools around here always looking for experienced tutors. And Margaret, with your organizational skills, I'm sure we could find something for you too if you both want to work." Margaret's pride and initial distrust seemed to war with the tempting offer. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked. "Wouldn't it be easier just to gradually pull Emily away from us? Legally, you have every right to her." James shook his head. "Easier, maybe, but it wouldn't be right." He looked at the door of the room where Emily slept. "Emily loves you. You're as much her family as I am. And if I've learned one thing in recent months, it's that family isn't just about blood or paperwork. It's about people who care, who protect you, who stand by you in your darkest hours." He paused. "Like you did when I couldn't." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Robert cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Could we at least see the apartment?" the older man asked. James smiled. It was a start. While rebuilding his relationship with Emily and sorting out the new arrangement with Margaret and Robert, James followed a darker trail, investigating who had kidnapped his daughter all those years ago. The old police file had reopened a door he could no longer keep shut. Someone close to him, someone he trusted, had orchestrated that tragedy. He discreetly hired a team of private investigators, the same people who had once searched for Lily, but now with a new focus, Victor Rhodes, his former business partner. Rhodes had been something of a mentor in the early days of Lancaster Enterprises. 15 years older, with connections throughout the corporate world, he guided James in crucial negotiations, helping turn a promising company into an empire. When Claire, Lily's mother, got pregnant, Rhodes was one of the first to know, offering advice about trusts and inheritance planning. Then, less than a month after Lily's disappearance, Rhodes sold his shares and left the company, citing health issues that supposedly required him to move to a warmer climate. James, devastated by his daughter's kidnapping, barely noticed the coincidence at the time. The investigators worked quickly, tracing money flows, scouring old records, interviewing former employees. Every new discovery confirmed James's suspicions. Rhodes had never been sick. The money from selling his shares had traveled through offshore accounts before returning to the UAS via a shell company. And, most damningly, the nanny who'd been with Lily that day, who was attacked, finally admitted she'd let Rhodes in on that fateful day. "He said you asked him to deliver some documents," the woman, now living under a different name in another state, explained. "I knew him. He was your partner. I had no reason to doubt him." Each new piece of the puzzle only fueled James's anger, but he stayed calm, knowing he needed irrefutable evidence before acting. "Why would he do that?" he asked his head investigator in a late-night meeting after Emily was asleep. "We found something in the financial records," the man replied, sliding a folder across the table. Rhodes was deeply in debt, gambling, bad investments, a costly divorce. And there was a specific clause in the partnership agreement. If he sold his shares while you were still actively involved in the company, he'd get far less money. So he planned the kidnapping to destabilize me, James concluded, feeling sick. To make me step away from the company while dealing with the trauma, so he could sell his shares at maximum value. That's our theory, yes. But we don't think he planned to keep Lily alive. He probably intended that she wouldn't be found. James's blood ran cold as he realized what the investigator was implying. Rhodes hadn't just planned a kidnapping, he'd planned something much worse. If not for Margaret's intervention in finding little Emily. "We need more," James said, his voice steely. "I want him behind bars for life." As the investigation advanced, life in James's penthouse took on new routines. Margaret and Robert eventually accepted the apartment, though they insisted on paying symbolic rent. Emily now spent 4 days with James and 3 with her adoptive parents, an arrangement that worked for all of them. James's relationship with Emily improved day by day. He stopped trying to impress her with pricey gifts or fancy outings. Instead, he discovered the power of simply being present. He helped with her homework from her new school, a quality public school halfway between their apartments, chosen collectively with Emily's input. He read her bedtime stories. He learned to make a decent mac and cheese under Margaret's watchful supervision. "Oh, you got better," Emily commented one evening, enjoying the dish James had made. "The first time it was all sticky." "I have a good teacher," he replied, smiling at Margaret in the doorway. "2 good teachers," Emily corrected, pointing to herself with her fork. "I taught you too," James laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Even with the dark cloud of the Rhodes investigation hanging over him, these simple moments with his daughter were a balm to his soul. A week later, the investigation yielded solid proof. One of Rhodes's ex-bodyguards, now living in poverty and bitter at being fired without references, agreed to testify. He had driven the car that took Lily from the apartment years ago. He had evidence, photos, payment records, even a recording of Rhodes giving instructions to get rid of the child once the plan was complete. Armed with these findings, James finally took the case to the authorities. Rhodes, now living lavishly on a private island in the Caribbean, was extradited and arrested. The news dominated headlines for days. The sensational story of a business magnate who kidnapped his partner's daughter for greed. James shielded Emily as much as he could from the media circus. With his lawyer's help, he kept her identity a secret, referred to only as the child in official reports. To the outside world, Lily Lancaster had been found, but the details of her whereabouts for the past 6 years remained private. When Rhodes was finally sentenced to 30 years in prison without parole, James felt one painful chapter close. Justice had been served. His daughter was safe. Now at last they could truly move forward. On a Sunday afternoon, about a year after the trial, the unlikely family gathered in Central Park. It had become a tradition, Sunday picnics when the weather allowed. Margaret always made sandwiches and salads, Robert brought card and board games, and James provided dessert from a French bakery Emily loved. Emily, now 7, ran around with other kids, laughing as they tossed a frisbee. Her hair, now longer, gleamed under the summer sun. Every now and then, she glanced back at the 3 adults sitting on the checkered picnic blanket, as if to make sure they were still there, watching her. "She looks happy, doesn't she?" Margaret said, following James's gaze. "She does," he agreed. "We all do." Robert nodded, his hands busy building a card tower that Emily would inevitably knock over when she returned. "Who would have thought, a year ago, I was sleeping in an alley, and now I'm teaching history to privileged kids. And I'm helping manage charity events," Margaret added, referring to the job she'd taken at James's foundation. "And I learned that money can't buy the kind of wealth that truly matters," James concluded, watching his daughter do cartwheels on the grass with childlike abandon. Emily came running back, cheeks flushed with excitement and exercise. "Dad, look what Sophie taught me," she exclaimed, attempting a clumsy but enthusiastic cartwheel. "Amazing," James applauded. his heart filling with warmth at the word Dad flowing so naturally from her. It had taken months for her to feel comfortable calling him that. The first time had been in the courtroom after Rhodes's trial, when she held his hand and asked, "Can we go home now, Dad?" The moment was etched into his memory as a priceless treasure. "Margaret, Sir Robert, did you see?" Emily asked, turning to her other parents with the same enthusiasm. "We did, sweetheart," Margaret replied, smiling. "You're getting really good at that." Emily beamed, satisfied by everyone's approval. Then, impulsively, she flopped onto Robert's carefully built card tower, demolishing it in a flurry of laughter. "Emily?" Robert feigned outrage, though amusement shone in his eyes. "I spent 10 minutes on that. I'll help you build another one," she promised, already gathering the cards. "We'll make it even bigger." James watched the scene, marveling at the miracle his life had become. Emily and he had finally formed a father-daughter bond based on mutual respect and love. It took time, patience, late-night talks, repeated apologies, and many fulfilled promises. But now, when she called him Dad, when she ran into his arms after school, when she shared her secrets and dreams at bedtime, he knew they'd made it. Most importantly, with Margaret and Robert living close by and playing a vital role in her life, Emily understood she didn't have to choose between her two families. They had created something new together, something that didn't fit conventional models but worked perfectly for them. James had, for his part, learned that the true meaning of family goes far beyond blood. It's about those we choose to love and protect forever. Margaret and Robert had become family to him as well, in a way he never could have imagined. People who, in another life, he might have passed on the street without a second glance were now essential to his happiness and his daughter's. As the sun began to set over the park, casting golden shadows on the lawn, James felt a profound gratitude for every winding road that led him here, for the second chance he'd been given, for the improbable but perfect family they'd built together. Emily came to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder as they watched Margaret and Robert gently bicker about the best way to stack the cards. "Dad," she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you found me in that alley." James wrapped his arm around her, kissing the top of her head. "Me too, my love, me too."